So, imagine reaching the last stretch of your life with your name already carved into American music, only to wake up and see that same name pulled into a courtroom narrative so loud it threatens to drown out every love song people ever used to survive their own heartbreak. Smokey Robinson is 85, the gentle architect of Motown tenderness, a voice that taught generations how to cry without collapsing. And yet in May 2025, four former housekeepers filed a civil lawsuit in Los Angeles County Superior Court seeking at least $50 million, alleging repeated sexual assault and related claims over many years, while also alleging labor violations and a hostile work environment. And news coverage quickly noted that Robinson has denied wrongdoing through legal action that escalated the conflict into an even larger fight, including a countersuit seeking $500 million that framed the allegations as fabricated and reputationally destructive. The reason this lands as devastating is not just the scale of the numbers or the language of the pleadings. It is the timing and the identity collision. For decades, the world has treated Smokey as a symbol of softness, an artist whose public persona feels almost synonymous with emotional safety. And late-life controversy hits differently because there is less time for nuance to travel farther than the headline. It starts in a place that should be calm, the quiet rhythm of an older man who has already outlived most of the people who built the original Motown dream beside him. And then suddenly there's a press conference. There are masked faces in some reports. There are lawyers speaking in the sharp geometry of accusation and denial. And there is the modern reality that the public does not wait for a full record to form an opinion because the internet rewards certainty more than it rewards patience. In that environment, silence is interpreted as strategy, and any statement is interpreted as public relations. So the story becomes a tug of war between two kinds of language that do not translate well into each other, the language of art and the language of litigation. This is where the hook tightens, because Smokey Robinson did not build his legacy as a provocateur or an outlaw or a tabloid magnate. He built it as a craftsman of feeling, and when allegations of this kind attach themselves to a figure like that, fans experience something more intimate than disappointment. They experience a rupture in the place they stored comfort. The core question is not whether a celebrity can survive a scandal. Plenty do. The real question is what happens when the brand of a life has been gentleness itself, and the final chapter is framed as something darker, messier, and unresolved. The lawsuit described in reporting did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived at a stage of life where every public appearance already carries the weight of tribute, where every interview already sounds like a farewell tour of memories, where the audience looks at the face and sees history. And now that same face is being discussed in the language of claims, damages, and credibility. That is why the phrase devastating news fits the emotional reality even before any outcome is known, because the damage to legacy can begin long before a verdict, especially when the story becomes content. People do not just read about a case like this. They reenact it in comment sections. They splice it into short clips. They turn it into sides, and then the sides harden. For Smokey, the cruelty is structural. In court, you are a name on a caption. In culture, you are a symbol. And in your own home, you're an aging man who has already carried private storms most people never saw, now being asked to carry one more with cameras pointed at the gate. This is not a neat morality tale. It is a pressure chamber because even if you believe in due process, you also understand that reputations are tried in public long before they are tested in law. And when you're 85, there is something uniquely brutal about watching your life work become background noise to an accusation that demands the entire spotlight. The man who once made silence sound beautiful is now trapped inside a silence that people interpret however they want. And the more the story expands, the more it threatens to overwrite the simplest truth of fame, that the public will remember the last loud thing they heard, unless something even louder replaces it. Before the headlines, before the filings, before the words lawsuit and countersuit began orbiting his name, there was Detroit. To understand why the present feels so heavy, you have to return to the gray beginning. Smokey Robinson was born into a city that ran on iron, sweat, and survival. The north end of Detroit in the 1940s and 1950s did not reward softness. It sharpened you or it swallowed you. Families stacked inside narrow houses. Winters cut through cracked walls, and children learned early that hunger could be managed, but humiliation lingered. In that environment, sensitivity was not a currency. It was a liability. And yet Smokey's greatest weapon would become the very thing Detroit tried to harden out of him: emotional transparency. While other boys fought for space on sidewalks, he fought for space inside himself. He listened. He absorbed. He translated. Music was not fantasy. It was ventilation. When his mother died while he was still a child, something inside him fractured quietly. Grief arrived before he had the language to name it. The house changed temperature. The air felt heavier. The silence stayed longer than it should have. That silence would later become melody. There's a through line between that early loss and the man the world came to know. Smokey did not write from spectacle. He wrote from ache. He wrote from rooms where the only warmth came from bodies huddled under worn blankets. He wrote from bus rides where rejection followed rehearsal. He wrote from the experience of being different. His pale eyes inherited from a distant ancestor, drawing mockery from boys who sensed vulnerability. Detroit did not teach him to roar. It taught him to endure. By 17, he had already written more than 100 songs. That number matters because it speaks to obsession. Writing was not a hobby. It was self-preservation. Each lyric was a negotiation between pain and dignity. He learned early that emotion, when shaped, could become power. When he met Berry Gordy in 1957 and handed over that worn notebook filled with penciled prayers, it was not ambition alone he was offering. It was evidence that survival had already been transformed into craft. Motown did not just give Smokey a platform. It gave him structure. Inside that system, discipline became law. Songs were refined, harmonies calibrated, presentation controlled. The miracles were not simply friends singing together. They were the frontline experiment in a cultural revolution. Shop Around, becoming Motown's first million-selling hit, was not luck. It was the culmination of relentless rehearsal, economic hunger, and the refusal to let rejection become destiny. But the ascent carried its own pressure. Smokey was not just the face of the miracles. He became one of Motown's primary architects. He wrote for others. He produced. He polished. He listened when artists were unsure and stepped in when sessions stalled. That kind of creative centrality builds prestige, but it also builds exhaustion. 16-hour days blur the line between inspiration and obligation. When you are responsible for shaping the emotional soundtrack of a generation, there is no clean off switch. This is where the myth and the man begin to separate. Publicly, Smokey embodied grace. Privately, he was navigating the cost of perpetual output. The applause of crowds cannot silence the fatigue of overextension. The same mind that turns heartbreak into melody can also internalize pressure without visible cracks. Success, particularly in a segregated America where Black artists were denied equal dignity in hotels, restaurants, and radio spaces, demanded composure. You did not complain. You performed. You kept moving. For Smokey, Detroit never fully left him. Even as Motown revenue soared and his songwriting shaped artists who would become legends in their own right, the psychological imprint of scarcity remained. Scarcity of security. Scarcity of rest. Scarcity of unconditional safety. That mindset explains something essential about the present. When a late-life legal battle erupts, it does not land on a man who has only known ease. It lands on someone who has been conditioned to see every storm as existential. The young boy who wrote to stay warm becomes the older man who must sit still while accusations circulate. The teenager who endured executives dismissing his sound becomes the elder statesman watching media outlets reduce decades to headlines. The thread is endurance. But endurance, even when mastered, has limits. What makes the present so narratively powerful is the contrast. Smokey's life story is built on the premise that dignity can be constructed note by note, that a fragile voice can outlast brutal conditions, that rejection can be repurposed into resonance. Now that premise is being tested again, not in the recording studio, but in the legal arena. The stakes are different, the language harsher, the consequences more public. Detroit forged him in adversity. Motown refined him in discipline. Fame complicated him in ways that were less visible, but equally real. All of that history matters because it reframes the question: is this current chapter an aberration, or is it another crucible in a life defined by crucibles? When people hear devastating news, they often imagine sudden collapse. But Smokey Robinson's story has never been about suddenness. It has been about accumulation, of grief, of craft, of responsibility, of expectation. The lawsuit does not erase the Detroit boy tracing words on scraps of paper. It does not erase the songwriter who gave language to heartbreak America could not articulate. But it does force a collision between the myth built over 60 years and the reality of a legal system that cares nothing for melody. Part 2 of this story is not about innocence or guilt. It is about context. It is about understanding that before the headlines there was hunger, before the countersuit there was a notebook, before the cameras there was a child who discovered that pain could be reshaped into song. And that history does not resolve the present, but it deepens it. By the mid-1960s, Smokey Robinson was no longer just a young man with a notebook full of hope. He had become infrastructure. If Motown was a machine, polished and relentless, Smokey was one of its most precise internal gears. The Miracles gave the label its first million-selling hit, but what followed was something far more consequential. Smokey's pen began shaping the emotional architecture of an entire era. This is where the legend becomes layered. It wasn't only "You've Really Got a Hold on Me" or "The Tracks of My Tears." It was the consistency, the discipline, the almost surgical ability to extract vulnerability from the chaos of the 1960s and package it into something radio-friendly but emotionally devastating. Smokey understood something many artists never quite master. Restraint can be more powerful than spectacle. His falsetto did not overpower, it invited. His lyrics did not accuse, they confessed. Inside Hitsville, USA, the modest house on West Grand Boulevard that birthed Motown sound, Smokey moved between roles with unnerving calm. Singer, songwriter, producer, advisor. He wrote for The Temptations, for Mary Wells, for Marvin Gaye. He had Berry Gordy's trust not simply because he delivered hits, but because he delivered reliability. In an industry built on ego and volatility, reliability is currency. But reliability has a cost. By his late 20s, Smokey was working at a pace that bordered on unsustainable. Studio sessions blurred into tours. Tours dissolved into interviews. Interviews folded into writing sessions for the next act waiting in a hallway. 16-hour days were not exaggerations. They were routine. Motown was not just chasing chart positions. It was fighting for cultural legitimacy in a country still deeply fractured by race. Every record carried pressure beyond sales. Every performance was proof that Black excellence could not be dismissed. Smokey absorbed that pressure quietly. The public saw elegance. They saw tuxedos, synchronized choreography, a voice that felt like velvet under stage lights. They did not see the exhaustion in hotel rooms after shows in towns that refused to serve them dinner. They did not see the way creative perfectionism can metastasize into internal depletion. When you are responsible for shaping the sound of a generation, you begin to fear silence. That fear becomes subtle. It whispers that if you stop writing, you disappear. If you slow down, someone else replaces you. If you admit fatigue, you jeopardize the machine that feeds not only you, but dozens of other artists. Smokey's identity became entangled with output. The applause was not merely affirmation. It was validation that the sacrifice was justified. By 1970, at only 30 years old, he was wealthy, famous, and spiritually stretched thin. Critics hailed him as America's greatest living poet. The rock and roll press treated him as Motown's emotional compass. But internally, something was eroding. When your entire public existence revolves around expressing love, you can begin to lose contact with your own. This is where the third act of the earlier chapters begins to foreshadow what would later become collapse. Smokey attempted to step away from the Miracles in 1972, citing exhaustion and a desire to focus on family. It was a move that confused some fans and startled others. Why would the architect leave the building he helped design? Because architecture can become confinement. The farewell concerts were drenched in nostalgia, but beneath the nostalgia was relief. Relief that he might finally breathe without the constant hum of expectation. Yet even that retreat proved temporary. Music did not release him easily, nor did Motown. He returned, transitioned, adapted. The machine had changed. The industry was shifting. The sound of America was evolving. And evolution can feel like displacement. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, new genres began swallowing radio bandwidth. Disco surged. Then hip-hop emerged from boroughs far from Detroit. Smokey's style, elegant, measured, romantic, risked sounding dated in a market chasing edge and novelty. He reinvented himself with Cruisin and Being With You, and the song succeeded, but reinvention is not immunity. It is maintenance. Behind that maintenance, the pressure accumulated. Fame does not inoculate against loneliness. In fact, it often amplifies it. The more people recognize your name, the fewer truly know your interior life. Smokey's marriage to Claudette Robinson, his partner from the earliest Miracles days, began to fracture under the strain of distance and infidelity. Emotional fatigue blurred boundaries. Choices that might have seemed momentary became structural. The divorce that eventually followed was not a tabloid circus at the time, but it was internally catastrophic. A man who built a career on articulating devotion found himself unable to preserve his own. That contradiction is corrosive. When public persona and private reality drift too far apart, the self splits. Add to that the creeping presence of cocaine during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Not flamboyant excess, not headline-grabbing scandal, but a quiet descent. The drug did not arrive as rebellion. It arrived as anesthesia, a way to mute regret, a way to numb the space left by collapsing intimacy and relentless expectation. Smokey would later describe that period as spiritual erosion. He lost weight. He lost clarity. He lost the anchor that once grounded him. For a man whose entire mythology revolved around sensitivity, numbness was a particularly brutal irony. His eventual recovery, rooted in faith and intervention from unexpected spiritual counsel, became one of the quieter, redemptive arcs in soul music history. There was no explosive rehab narrative, no televised confessionals. Instead, there was recalibration, a slowing, a reorientation toward purpose rather than applause. Why does this matter in the context of the current legal storm? Because Smokey Robinson's life has been a sequence of reinventions under pressure. Poverty to promise, promise to prominence, prominence to exhaustion, exhaustion to collapse, collapse to recovery, recovery to elder statesman. Each chapter has tested not his talent, but his identity. Now, at 85, the lawsuit introduces a different kind of test. This one does not concern charts or creative stamina. It concerns credibility. It concerns moral perception. It concerns whether decades of disciplined image can withstand modern scrutiny amplified by digital speed. The boy from Detroit learned early that rejection does not kill a dream. Surrender does. The young executive at Motown learned that perfection does not prevent burnout. Only boundaries do. The middle-aged man in spiritual crisis learned that numbness does not erase pain. Only confrontation does. The elder facing legal allegations must now navigate something even more complex. The understanding that legacy is not static. It is negotiated in real time. And in the age of instant commentary, that negotiation happens publicly. Part 3 is not a resolution. It is escalation. Because the higher the pedestal, the farther the potential fall. And Smokey Robinson did not build a small pedestal. He built a monument. Part Bond is where everything converges. Not the songs, not the nostalgia, not even the addiction and recovery arc that once nearly ended him. This chapter is about pressure applied to legacy in real time. It is about what happens when a man who survived poverty, betrayal, industry exhaustion, and spiritual collapse must now stand inside the most unforgiving arena of all, public accusation amplified by modern media. When the lawsuit was filed in 2025, it did not arrive as a whisper. It arrived structured, documented, and immediately syndicated. For former employees alleged repeated sexual misconduct spanning years and sought substantial damages in civil court. Within hours, headlines were everywhere. The legal terminology, assault, hostile work environment, coercion, carried weight that no publicist can soften. Smokey Robinson's legal team responded firmly, denying wrongdoing and escalating with a massive countersuit that reframed the accusations as false and reputationally destructive. But in the age of instant judgment, escalation does not quiet a storm. It intensifies it. For decades, Smokey's identity has been built around emotional literacy. He was the man who wrote the soundtrack to heartbreak without cruelty. The man whose falsetto felt like reassurance. So when allegations of this nature attach themselves to that image, the shock multiplies. This is not just celebrity scandal fatigue. This is identity dissonance. And identity dissonance is powerful because fans do not merely consume music. They attach memory to it. First dances, funerals, long drives, quiet nights. Smokey's voice has lived inside people's most intimate moments. So when his name is placed inside a courtroom narrative, audiences feel a personal rupture. The legal system, however, does not operate on emotional memory. It operates on claims, responses, evidence, and procedure. In that arena, legacy offers no immunity. Fame offers no procedural advantage. The filing does not ask whether you shaped Motown. It asks whether specific conduct occurred. This is the structural cruelty of late-life controversy. Earlier in a career, there is time to rebuild image. There is time for reinvention tours, reflective interviews, public apologies, rebranding arcs. At 85, time compresses. Every month carries more weight than it did decades earlier. The narrative hardens faster. Inside his home, according to close accounts described in various reports, Smokey maintained composure. Not flamboyant defiance. Not emotional spectacle. Restraint. The restraint mirrors the pattern of his entire life. He has never been the loudest voice in the room. But silence in modern culture can be interpreted as evasion just as easily as dignity. And here lies the tension. When you have built a lifetime around discipline, do you suddenly pivot into aggressive public defense? Or do you remain consistent and risk being misunderstood? For Smokey, the stakes extend beyond financial damages. The number attached to the countersuit, $500 million, signals more than legal maneuvering. It signals reputational warfare. It suggests that what is being defended is not simply assets, but narrative. Narrative is everything at this stage, because Smokey Robinson is not merely an individual. He's a cultural artifact, a bridge figure from segregated America to mainstream global influence. A reminder that Black artistry could be both commercially dominant and emotionally refined. That kind of symbolism amplifies scrutiny. Cultural icons are rarely allowed private battles. The lawsuit also forces a generational collision. Younger audiences approach allegations through the lens of accountability culture. Older audiences approach them through the lens of legacy protection. Both perspectives exist simultaneously online, often clashing in comment sections with far more certainty than the legal process allows. And this is where the emotional complexity deepens. It is possible to acknowledge the seriousness of allegations while also recognizing that civil litigation unfolds through procedure, not trending hashtags. It is possible to respect accusers' rights to file claims while also respecting the presumption of innocence in a court of law. but nuance rarely trends. For Smokey, the psychological toll may not be visible, but it is implicit. He has already endured public divorce, addiction exposure, industry decline, and the gradual loss of peers. Now, in the final chapter of his life, he faces something uniquely destabilizing: the possibility that his name could become contested territory. There is a particular loneliness in being an elder icon under accusation. Many of the people who once stood beside him in the early Motown days are gone. The brotherhood that once buffered external pressure no longer exists in the same form. Surviving into your mid-80s means outliving your original shield. So he stands largely alone in this storm. That does not mean unprotected. It means structurally isolated. Fame does not eliminate isolation. It often heightens it. The deeper question, beyond legal outcomes, is philosophical. What is legacy made of? Is it the sum of artistic contributions? Is it personal conduct? Is it public perception? Or is it the unstable mixture of all three? Smokey's life has always argued that dignity can be built patiently, that survival is an art form, that humility, even under praise, matters. Now, that philosophy is being stress-tested in a new way. And here is the uncomfortable truth. No matter the eventual legal resolution, this chapter becomes part of the story. Not necessarily as a verdict, but as a complication. The mythology of Smokey Robinson will never again be entirely uncomplicated nostalgia. It will contain a footnote. How large that footnote becomes depends on time, evidence, and outcomes that are still unfolding. Part bond is not about deciding guilt. It is about recognizing that the final act of a life can become as dramatic as the rise. It is about watching an icon navigate the collision between memory and accusation. It is about understanding that greatness does not exempt someone from scrutiny, and scrutiny does not automatically define someone's entire existence. The storm is not finished. It is still gathering, still moving through courts, still shaping public perception in real time. And the man who once taught the world how heartbreak sounds must now endure a heartbreak of reputation. Part Nom is not about the courtroom. It is about consequence, not legal consequence. Those proceedings will unfold on their own timeline, but emotional and existential consequence. Because long before any verdict is reached, something irreversible has already happened. Smokey Robinson's name has entered a different category of public conversation. When a cultural figure crosses into allegation territory, the shift is immediate. Interviews that once focused on legacy pivot toward legal context. Biographical retrospectives become framed with caution. Award tributes carry unspoken tension. Even silence feels heavier. For Smokey, this is not the first time his identity has fractured under pressure. The difference now is age. Earlier in life, crisis carried momentum. There was youth to absorb shock. There was time to course correct. At 85, time does not stretch. It condenses. The lawsuit forces him into a strange psychological space, defending a lifetime rather than a moment. When you are 25, you defend actions. When you are 85, you defend the narrative of who you have been for decades. That distinction matters. Smokey Robinson has always positioned himself as a craftsman of sincerity. His lyrics leaned toward confession rather than conquest. His falsetto felt like vulnerability, not dominance. The image built over 6 decades is not merely that of a successful singer. It is that of a gentle presence in American culture. So when accusations of harm surface, the collision is not only factual, it is symbolic. Symbols are fragile. They do not bend easily. They either endure or they crack. In the modern media ecosystem, endurance is complicated. Social platforms compress timelines. Allegations circulate faster than legal clarification. Opinion forms before evidence is examined. The courtroom works slowly. The internet works instantly. And so Smokey stands inside 2 systems operating at different speeds. One demands patience. The other rewards reaction. It is here that his lifelong discipline becomes central again. Throughout his career, he avoided explosive public feuds. He did not chase spectacle. Even during his period of addiction, his collapse remained largely private until he chose to speak about it later. His pattern has always been controlled response rather than impulsive defense. But this time, the defense is institutional. Lawyers file motions. Statements are drafted. Countersuits escalate the scale. The number attached to his legal response, $500 million, signals that he is not treating this as a small misunderstanding. It signals that he views the accusations as existentially threatening to his reputation. And reputation, at this stage, is everything. Because Smokey's life story is inseparable from Motown's moral mythology. Motown represented polish, professionalism, crossover dignity during an era of segregation. Smokey was one of its cleanest faces. If that face becomes contested, it ripples backward into the narrative of the institution itself. This is why Part Nom must widen the lens. It is not just about one man's legal defense. It is about how America processes its icons, particularly black icons who were once elevated as proof of refinement, grace, and cultural bridge building. When allegations arise against such figures, the reaction often splits along generational, racial, and ideological lines. Some see accusation and demand immediate moral distancing. Others see accusation and demand due process before judgment. Both responses operate simultaneously, often without conversation between them. Smokey, at 85, cannot control that debate. He can only control how he carries himself within it. Those close to him have described a measured demeanor. Not panic, not visible rage. Measured. That consistency is either interpreted as composure or calculated calm, depending on the viewer's lens. And this is the inescapable truth of public life. Once perception fractures, control becomes partial at best. Yet there is something quietly defiant about surviving into your mid-80s and still refusing to let chaos dictate your posture. Smokey has already rebuilt from collapse once. He has already faced addiction, divorce, financial complexity, and the erosion of industry dominance. Each time, he recalibrated rather than combusted. The question now is whether recalibration is even possible in a climate this polarized. There is another dimension to this stage of life: mortality awareness. When you're 25, legacy feels distant. When you're 85, it feels immediate. Every public moment could be one of the last defining ones. Every headline could become the sentence that opens future biographies. That awareness sharpens everything. For Smokey, the fight is not simply about money. It is about how his grandchildren will read about him. It is about how the Detroit boy who wrote to survive winter will be remembered in history books. It is about whether the story ends with harmony or with unresolved discord. And yet, paradoxically, he cannot rush the resolution. Courts do not move at the pace of emotion. Evidence does not bend to nostalgia. Part Nom, then, is about tension without release. It is about the suspended state between accusation and adjudication. It is about the emotional endurance required to wake up each day knowing that strangers are debating your character online. It is about a man who once sang "The Tracks of My Tears," now walking through a different kind of track, one laid out in legal filings and public speculation. The devastating aspect of this chapter is not spectacle. It is ambiguity. It is the reality that uncertainty may linger longer than comfort allows. And still he stands. Not cleared, not condemned, standing. That stance, fragile, aging, deliberate, may ultimately define this chapter more than any headline ever could. Part Sal is where the story becomes less about accusation and more about time, because time is the only force that ultimately outlasts scandal, applause, and even court rulings. And for Smokey Robinson, time has already been both executioner and redeemer. When you live long enough to see generations cycle through your music, you also live long enough to watch culture change around you. Standards evolve. Conversations about power, consent, accountability, and institutional protection shift. What once remained private now becomes litigated and publicly dissected. What once could be quietly resolved now lives forever in searchable archives. Smokey belongs to a generation raised in a radically different social architecture. That fact does not excuse or condemn anything. It contextualizes the collision. The values that shaped Motown in the 1960s were built inside an industry that demanded composure and silence. The values shaping discourse in the 2020s demand transparency and scrutiny. Those two eras do not naturally align. This is the uncomfortable friction beneath the legal filings, a cultural reckoning layered on top of a personal battle. Smokey is not just defending himself in court. He is navigating a society that now interrogates power structures more aggressively than at any other point in his lifetime. For a man who survived segregation-era touring, who endured restaurants refusing service, who performed for audiences divided by race, the idea that his name could now sit inside accusations of misconduct is not merely reputational risk. It is existential contradiction. But contradiction has followed him before. He sang about perfect love while his marriage was deteriorating. He projected composure while privately battling addiction. He carried the image of stability while wrestling with internal fracture. Each time, the contradiction forced transformation. What makes this chapter heavier is its proximity to the end of life. There is no guarantee of narrative redemption in old age. There is only the possibility of endurance. And endurance has always been Smokey's defining trait. Endurance when his mother died. Endurance when Detroit winters cut through walls. Endurance when executives dismissed early auditions. Endurance when addiction hollowed him out. Endurance when peers passed away one by one, leaving him one of the last living witnesses to Motown's birth. Now the endurance required is psychological rather than physical. It is the endurance of being discussed rather than celebrated, of having your legacy debated rather than assumed. For many icons, late life becomes a period of ceremonial reverence, lifetime achievement awards, documentary retrospectives, gentle interviews. Smokey's later years have begun to take that shape. He toured selectively. He spoke about faith. He reflected on artistry with calm detachment. The lawsuit interrupts that arc. It replaces serenity with uncertainty. It reopens questions instead of closing chapters. But there is something else unfolding beneath the surface. The longer someone lives, the less control they have over how history arranges them. Smokey has spent decades shaping melody. He has not been able to shape how culture will ultimately categorize him. Legacy is not self-written. It is collectively negotiated. The final philosophical tension here is simple but powerful. Can a lifetime of artistic contribution coexist with unresolved legal controversy? History suggests yes. Cultural memory is complex. It rarely flattens a person into a single dimension. But the coexistence is rarely comfortable. For Smokey, comfort may no longer be the goal. Survival of dignity may be. Those close to him describe a man who continues writing, continues reflecting, continues practicing faith. That continuation matters. It signals refusal to retreat into bitterness. It signals a commitment to identity beyond accusation. There's a line often repeated in discussions of legacy. You are not the worst thing said about you, nor the best thing written about you. Smokey's life embodies that tension. He is not solely the boy from Detroit, nor solely the Motown miracle, nor solely the man battling addiction, nor solely the defendant in a civil lawsuit. He is the accumulation. Parts Out does not resolve the legal question. It reframes the emotional question. What does resilience look like at 85? It does not look loud. It looks measured. It looks like continuing to wake up and engage the day despite uncertainty. It looks like allowing lawyers to argue while you protect your interior self from corrosion. It looks like trusting that time, even when harsh, eventually settles into perspective. For audiences, the challenge is similar. It is easy to rush to moral finality. It is harder to sit inside ambiguity. But ambiguity is where most human stories actually live. Smokey Robinson's life is no longer a clean arc from poverty to legend. It is a layered narrative with brilliance, fracture, reinvention, and now public tension. That layering does not erase the music, nor does the music erase the questions. Part Sao is the stillness before historical judgment. It is the moment where the man and the myth are separated by legal language and cultural debate. And he is still here, breathing, aging, writing, waiting. Because long after court documents yellow and headlines sink beneath newer storms, what remains is interpretation. Not legal interpretation, cultural interpretation. And Smokey Robinson's life has always existed at the intersection of culture and emotion. When the applause fades, when the interviews stop, when the debates quiet down, what is left? For Smokey, what remains is a body of work that shaped how America sounds when it loves, when it aches, when it remembers. That fact does not dissolve controversy. It does not pre-answer legal questions, but it does complicate the impulse to flatten him into a single headline. The most devastating chapters of a life are rarely the loudest ones. They're the ones that force confrontation with self. At 85, Smokey Robinson is not fighting for chart positions. He is not chasing reinvention. He is confronting something more intimate, how he will be remembered. And memory is mercilessly selective. Some will remember the Detroit boy who turned cold rooms into poetry. Some will remember the Motown craftsman who wrote hits that crossed racial barriers. Some will remember the man who nearly lost himself to addiction and rebuilt through faith. Some will remember the lawsuit and the headlines that followed. All of those versions will coexist. That is the reality of legacy in the modern age. There is no singular narrative. There is only accumulation. The question is not whether Smokey's story has become complicated. It always was. The question is whether complexity invalidates contribution. For decades, Smokey's music taught listeners that love is imperfect, that devotion can fracture, that regret can coexist with tenderness. His lyrics never promised purity. They promised honesty about feeling. Perhaps that is the unexpected mirror of this final chapter. The life behind the voice is not pristine. It is human. Human lives contain brilliance and failure. Public figures simply experience those dimensions under magnification. There is something quietly sobering about watching an icon age inside public scrutiny. We are accustomed to legends as static images, frozen in their prime, preserved in vinyl sleeves and award ceremonies. But legends are not statues. They are aging bodies carrying history forward day by day. Smokey Robinson is still here. That matters. He has outlived many of the voices that once harmonized beside him. He has survived industry shifts that erased others. He has endured personal collapse and spiritual rebirth. Now he stands inside a different kind of test, one that does not reward melody, but resilience. Resilience, however, has always been his deepest instrument. Not the falsetto, not the pen. Resilience. The boy who traced lyrics on grocery scraps did not know he would one day defend his name in courtrooms. The young songwriter who handed Berry Gordy a notebook did not imagine that decades later, journalists would weigh his entire life against civil allegations. But life rarely follows linear scripts. The final act of Smokey Robinson's story is still unfolding. Courts will decide legal outcomes. Historians will contextualize them. Audiences will draw their own lines between art and artist. What remains constant is this: greatness does not eliminate vulnerability. Longevity does not prevent controversy. And dignity is tested most fiercely when silence feels safer than defense. In the twilight of a long career, Smokey's most powerful gesture may not be a performance. It may be composure, continuing to write, continuing to believe that truth, whatever form it ultimately takes, will settle. There's a line implicit in his life. Survival is not glamorous. It is repetitive. It is waking up again after disappointment. It is enduring misunderstanding without surrendering identity. For viewers, the challenge is equally personal. Can we hold complexity without rushing to simplification? Can we acknowledge the weight of allegations without erasing decades of cultural impact? Can we recognize that art can shape us even when the artist's humanity is imperfect? Smokey Robinson's journey, from Detroit poverty to global influence, from addiction to spiritual recovery, from applause to accusation, argues one central truth. Legacy is not a straight line. It is a mosaic. Some tiles shine, some crack. The devastating news is not simply that a lawsuit exists. It is that even in the final chapter of life, peace is never guaranteed. Yet neither is collapse. At 85, Smokey Robinson stands not as a flawless icon, but as a man whose life contains triumph, fracture, and endurance in equal measure. And perhaps that is the most honest ending possible. Not certainty, not erasure, but humanity.